The zipper stopped halfway up her spine and refused to move. Odessa Gibson stood absolutely still in the center of a room that had probably hosted governors, while a woman named Carol, sensible shoes, no warmth, tugged at the back of an ivory gown with the focused aggression of someone defusing a bomb. Two other attendants watched from a polite distance, saying nothing, which was somehow worse than laughing. She kept her face neutral. She'd been practicing. Her mother had coached her on the drive up, chin level. Don't fidget. Don't look poor. Odessa had sat in the passenger seat watching Michigan's flat gray January blur past and thought, not for the first time, that the whole situation might actually be happening to someone else. Some other girl with her same face and her same quiet desperation and her same absent options. The door opened without a knock. He didn't look at her the way men usually looked at her. He looked at the room, assessed it, and then, briefly, clinically, looked at her like she was part of the inventory. "She's 18, he said. Still not to her. To Gerald, his attorney, who had materialized somewhere to his left like a man who had learned to appear on cue. 19 in March, Gerald offered helpfully. Gaes Bale said nothing. His silence was louder than most men's arguments. She lifted her chin, looked directly at him. He was already turning away. Something lodged itself quietly between her ribs, not heartbreak, not yet. Something smaller and sharper. The particular ache of being evaluated and found inconvenient. And underneath it, almost too quiet to hear, something else entirely. Relief? Because if he didn't want this either, maybe there was still a way out. She pressed one hand, briefly, unconsciously, flat against her lower stomach. Then she smoothed the fabric and stood up straight. Odessa Gibson had grown up in a house where the heat worked 3 weeks out of 4, where her mother ironed her school uniforms at 5 in the morning so she could arrive looking like someone who had options, and where the word struggle was never spoken aloud because naming it made it permanent. She was the kind of girl who studied hard not because anyone told her to, but because a scholarship was the only door she could see from where she was standing. She had gotten into University of Michigan, full ride, pre-law, and for approximately 6 weeks last autumn, she had believed her life was about to begin. Then her mother got sick. Not the manageable kind of sick. The kind that arrived with paperwork, with specialist appointments that cost more than their monthly rent, with a prognosis delivered in a beige hospital room by a doctor who wouldn't meet their eyes. Stage 3. Aggressive. Expensive. Her uncle Terence, her mother's older brother, a man Odessa had always quietly distrusted for reasons she couldn't name until now, had presented the arrangement like it was a gift. The Bale family needs a wife. A quiet one. Presentable. The debt disappears. Your mother gets private care. You get security. He'd said security the way people said it when they meant cage. Odessa had sat at their kitchen table in a yellow cardigan, her acceptance letter from Michigan still on the refrigerator behind him, held up by a strawberry magnet, and she had done the math that no 18-year-old should ever have to do. She'd said yes. She hadn't cried until she was in the shower, where the sound couldn't travel. Gaes Bale had been married once. Her name had been Leanne, and she had been brilliant and impatient and gone before 50. An aneurysm. No warning. He had been in Tokyo closing a deal when it happened, and by the time he landed back in Detroit, there was nothing left to do except stand in a funeral home and sign things. That was 4 years ago. He hadn't grieved the way people expected. He'd gone back to work in 8 days, which his board appreciated and his sister Ellen did not. Ellen, who was 53 and sharp-tongued and the only person alive who could walk into his office without knocking and survive it, had told him plainly last Thanksgiving, "You are building a monument to busyness so you don't have to feel the floor under your feet." He had poured himself a drink and changed the subject. The arrangement had been Gerald's idea, sourced through channels Gaes hadn't asked too many questions about, which was itself a sign of how untethered he'd become. He didn't need a wife. He needed, his attorney had argued, the optics of stability. There was a hostile board situation. There were acquisition talks. There were men in rooms who still, absurdly, trusted a married man more than a widower who worked until midnight and kept a single photograph on his desk. He'd agreed the way he agreed to most things now, efficiently, without examining why. He had not expected her to look at him the way she had in that dressing room. Not with fear. Not with performance. Just directly. Like she was calculating something. It had bothered him more than it should have. He was still thinking about it 2 days later, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Detroit penthouse in a navy wool robe, coffee going cold in his hand, watching the city move below like it had no idea. Ellen appeared in his peripheral vision, already dressed, already armed. She's a child, Gaes. I'm aware. You're going to ruin her life. Gerald assures me the arrangement is mutual and beneficial. Ellen looked at him the way she always looked at him when he used words like arrangement and beneficial for things that were actually human. She's 18 years old and she said yes because someone put her in an impossible position. The pause. That's not consent. That's survival. He didn't answer, which, with Ellen, was as good as admitting she was right. They met formally for the first time 3 days later, in the sitting room off the estate's main hall. Odessa arrived in a soft rust-colored turtleneck tucked into dark brown trousers, her hair out, a large, carefully shaped natural halo that—
If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more amazing love stories. Alright, back to the story.
She'd clearly spent time on, which told him she was nervous even though her face said otherwise. Gaes wore a dark gray crewneck and black trousers. No performance on either side. Just two people in a room that had been arranged for them by other people, with a tea tray neither of them touched. She sat across from him with her hands folded and said, before he could speak, "I need you to know I'm not here because I want to be." He looked at her. "Neither am I." A beat of silence stretched between them, not comfortable, not hostile. Something rare. Honest. It was the best conversation they'd had so far. It lasted 11 seconds. The marriage happened on a Tuesday. No ceremony. No flowers. No one cried, which Odessa had prepared herself for, but still felt like a small stone dropping into still water somewhere inside her chest. A judge. A sitting room. Gerald with his folder. Her Uncle Terence in his good coat, looking satisfied in a way that made her want to leave the country. She signed her name in blue ink and became Mrs. Odessa Bale at 11:14 in the morning while outside, Michigan carried on completely indifferent. Gaes signed without reading anything, which she found either infuriating or impressive depending on the second. They did not kiss. The judge didn't suggest it. Everyone in the room seemed quietly relieved by that. The estate had 12 bedrooms. Gerald had informed her of this with the energy of someone presenting a significant benefit, as though square footage was the metric by which she should measure her comfort. Odessa had nodded and asked which room was hers. Gerald had blinked, surprised she realized that she'd assumed they would be separate, which told her everything about what everyone else had assumed. Her room was on the 3rd floor, east wing. Cream walls, a window seat overlooking a bare winter garden, bookshelves that someone had already stocked. Novels, mostly, a few volumes of poetry. She stood in the doorway for a long moment looking at the books, wondering if that had been deliberate or coincidental. She decided not to find out. Deciding things like that, reading into small gestures, building architecture out of accidents, was how you got hurt in situations like this. She unpacked her 2 suitcases and put her strawberry magnet on the mini refrigerator in the corner. It helped. Marginally. The inciting moment came not dramatically, as she might have written it in the pre-law essay she'd never gotten to submit, but quietly, the way most things that change you do. 4 days into living in the same house, she came downstairs at 11:30 at night in an oversized cream sleep shirt and gray cotton shorts because she couldn't sleep and she'd run out of the chamomile her mother swore by, and she found Gaes Bale sitting at the kitchen island in the dark. Not brooding. Not performing solitude. Just sitting. In a white thermal long sleeve and dark flannel pants, reading glasses she hadn't seen before perched at the end of his nose, a manila folder open in front of him and an untouched glass of water at his elbow. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I didn't know you wore glasses," she said, because it was the only true thing she could find. He looked at her over the frames. "I didn't know you existed 3 weeks ago." It wasn't cruel. It wasn't kind. It was just accurate. And something about its accuracy made her exhale a laugh before she could stop it. Short, quiet, surprised out of her. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The precondition of one. She crossed to the pantry, found nothing useful, and settled for a glass of water she didn't particularly want. She stood at the counter 6 feet from him, drinking it slowly, and he went back to his folder, and neither of them made a move to fill the silence. It was the longest she'd been in a room with him without feeling like furniture. She set the glass down and turned to go. Stopped. "Do you always work this late?" He didn't look up. "Do you always come downstairs in the dark?" She thought about it. "Only when things are loud in my head." The pause. He turned a page. "Then yes," he said quietly. "I always work this late." She stood there one breath longer than necessary. Then she went back upstairs, got into her cream-walled room, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling, aware, with a precision that unsettled her, of exactly which part of the house he was still sitting in. It became a pattern without either of them deciding it would. Not every night. Not even most nights. But enough nights that Odessa stopped being surprised to find the under-cabinet lights already on when she came downstairs. Enough nights that she started wearing her navy blue zip-up hoodie over her sleep shirt without thinking about it. Not for him, she told herself, just because the kitchen tiles were cold and the hoodie was near the door. She told herself that for about a week before she stopped bothering. He never acknowledged the pattern either, which she respected in a way she couldn't fully explain. There was no you again or performative casualness. He would simply look up, register her presence, and return to whatever he was doing. Sometimes she sat at the island across from him with a book. Sometimes she made tea. She'd found a box of chamomile in the back of the second pantry shelf and had quietly, deeply, felt like the universe owed her that one. Sometimes they talked. More often they didn't. The talking, when it happened, arrived sideways. He asked her once, without looking up from a contract, what she'd planned to study. She told him pre-law. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why law? She'd thought about giving him the safe answer, to help people, to make a difference, the answer she'd written in her scholarship essay. Instead she heard herself say, "Because I grew up watching people get taken advantage of by paperwork. I wanted to be the person who could read the paperwork." He looked up then. "That's a better answer than most lawyers give," he said. She didn't know what to do with that, so she turned a page in her book and pretended she'd been reading all along. 3 weeks in, Ellen came for dinner. Ellen Bale arrived the way she did everything, announced but unstoppable, in a burgundy wool coat and dark-fitted trousers, reading Odessa in one long look and then pulling her into a hug that Odessa hadn't braced for and therefore actually felt. "You're too young for this house," Ellen said into her shoulder. "We're going to be friends." Odessa pulled back and looked at her. "Does he know you do this?" "He knows better than to have an opinion about it." From the hallway, Gaes appeared in a dark green button-down and black trousers, sleeves rolled to the forearm. He looked at his sister, then at Odessa, then back at his sister with the expression of a man who had learned that some battles were geological in timescale. "You're early," he said. "You're emotionally unavailable," Ellen replied pleasantly. "We all have our flaws." Odessa pressed her lips together very hard. Dinner was set in the smaller dining room, not the formal one with the chandelier that she still found vaguely threatening, and the atmosphere loosened in Ellen's presence the way a window loosens a sealed room. Odessa wore a deep burgundy midi dress with long sleeves and small gold earrings, her hair pinned back softly with a few curls left loose at her temples. Across the table, Gaes had added a dark navy blazer over his green shirt, which was as close to formal as she'd seen him outside of the wedding day. Ellen talked. Gaes responded in full sentences, which was more than he gave most conversations. Odessa watched the two of them, the shorthand, the old argument, the precise frequency on which siblings operate, and felt something move through her that she didn't immediately name. Longing maybe. For her mother. For her own kitchen. For a table she'd chosen. Then Gaes passed her the bread basket without being asked, and she realized she'd reached for it at the same moment he'd already moved it toward her, and their fingers didn't touch but almost did, a half-inch of air between them that somehow registered louder than contact. She took the bread. He looked away. Ellen saw everything and said nothing, which meant she was storing it. The shift happened on a Sunday. He found her in the East Library, the smaller one, lined in dark wood and smelling of old paper, sitting cross-legged on the window seat in an oversized oatmeal-colored sweater and dark leggings, a legal textbook open in her lap. She'd found it on the shelf 3 days ago and hadn't been able to leave it alone. He stopped in the doorway. "You're reading Prosser on torts. It was on your shelf. That's a second-year law school text." She looked up. "I know. I looked it up." The pause. "Is that a problem?" He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not assessment. Something closer to recalibration. "There's a better edition," he said finally. "I'll have Gerald order it." "I don't need Gerald to order it. I can order a book." "I know you can." The beat. "I'll have Gerald order it anyway." She stared at him. He was already turning down the hall. "That's not," she started. But he was gone, and she was left in the window seat with the winter garden below and a legal textbook and the unsettling realization that her heart was beating slightly faster than the situation required. She pressed her palm flat against the open page. "Stop it," she told herself. Her body, with complete indifference to instruction, did not stop it. That night she came downstairs and he wasn't there. The under-cabinet lights were off. The kitchen was empty and still and faintly cold. She stood in the doorway in her navy zip-up and cream sleep shirt and felt the absence of him with a specificity that frightened her. She made chamomile anyway. Sat at the island alone. Halfway through the mug, she heard his voice from somewhere in the east corridor, low, controlled, the particular flatness he used on calls he didn't want to be on. She couldn't hear the words. Then a different voice, female, warm, familiar with him. Who calls a man at midnight and gets that tone? Odessa set her mug down. She didn't go to find out. She was not that girl, not the girl who listened at corridors or assembled suspicion from shadows. She was rational, practical. She had gone into this arrangement with her eyes open. She rinsed her mug, went upstairs, got into bed, lay in the dark with the ceiling above her and the voice-shaped silence below her and the completely inconvenient truth sitting directly on her sternum. She cared who was on that phone. She squeezed her eyes shut. Outside, snow had begun to fall on the winter garden, quiet and indifferent and covering everything. Lovely viewers. She cared who was on that phone, and that single realization was going to cost her everything she'd promised herself she wouldn't feel. The question is, when a girl who entered a cage...
If you're enjoying the story so far, Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more amazing love stories. Alright, back to the story.
With her eyes wide open, starts to mistake the bars for something beautiful. Is that growth, or is it surrender? And what happens when the man on the other side of those bars is hiding something that could shatter the fragile, unnamed thing growing quietly between them? She found out about the phone call the way she found out most things in that house. Not by asking, but by being present when the truth got tired of hiding. It was Ellen who told her 11 days later, over tea in the sitting room while snow pressed itself flat against the windows outside. Odessa was in a warm caramel turtleneck and dark olive trousers, her hair in a high puff, both hands around her mug. Ellen sat across from her in a cobalt blue blouse and gray slacks, legs crossed, turning her own cup slowly. "The woman who calls him at midnight," Ellen said without preamble, "is his late wife's sister." Odessa said nothing. "Her name is Renata. She calls because she grieves and she doesn't know where else to put it. And Gaes answers because guilt is the only emotion he's allowed himself to feel consistently for 4 years." Ellen looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you because you went quiet after that night, and I recognize what quiet looks like on a woman who's decided to feel less." Odessa set her mug down with more precision than necessary. "I wasn't," she started. "You were," Ellen said. Simply. Without accusation. The room held the silence between them like it was something fragile. "I don't have the right to feel anything about his phone calls," Odessa said finally. Her voice was level. She'd worked for that levelness. "Rights," Ellen said, "have very little to do with feelings. You of all people should know that by now." That evening Gaes found her in the winter garden. She hadn't meant to be there. She'd stepped outside for air and then kept walking, and the garden in January was a skeletal, honest kind of beautiful that she hadn't expected. Dead things arranged with dignity. She stood on the stone path in her caramel turtleneck and a long charcoal wool coat she'd grabbed from the hook by the door, her breath making soft clouds in the cold. He came out in a black wool coat over a dark gray sweater, no gloves, which she had already learned was typical of a man who moved through discomfort like it was weather. He stood beside her. Not close. Appropriate distance. They looked at the garden. "Ellen told you," he said. "Yes." "What did she tell you?" "Enough." A long pause. The cold settled around them, specific and clean. "Leanne died while I was closing a deal in Tokyo," he said. Not emotional. Just factual. The way men delivered things they'd carried so long the weight had become structural. I knew she hadn't been feeling well. She told me it was a headache. I got on the plane anyway. Odessa turned to look at him. He was still looking at the garden. "I have run every version of that decision," he continued quietly, "for 4 years. Different outcomes. Same plane." "You couldn't have known," she said. "No." He exhaled. "But I also didn't stay. And those are different things." She understood that distinction in her body before her mind caught up. The difference between fate and choice. Between what was taken and what was left behind. She had her own version of it. A scholarship letter on a refrigerator. A yes she'd said in a yellow cardigan that she'd never been able to fully call either brave or defeated. "I said yes to this arrangement," she said, surprising herself with the direction of her own voice, "because my mother is sick and I didn't have another door. But I keep waiting to feel like a victim." She paused. "I don't entirely. And I don't know what to do with that." Turned then, looked at her, fully, the way he hadn't allowed himself to in the dressing room, in the sitting room, across any of the careful distances they'd maintained. "You're not a victim," he said. "You're someone who made an impossible decision with incomplete information and insufficient options." The pause. "That's not weakness. That's just being alive in difficult circumstances." She looked at him for a long moment. That's the kindest thing you've said to me. I haven't been particularly trying. No, she agreed. You haven't. Something passed between them in the cold, not a confession, not a declaration. Something quieter and more dangerous. Recognition. The particular vertigo of being seen by someone you hadn't expected to see you. She was 17 weeks pregnant. She hadn't told anyone. Not Ellen. Not her mother. The small, terrifying truth of it lived in a white stick in the back of her nightstand drawer and in the way she sometimes pressed her hand to her lower stomach when she thought no one was watching. It wasn't Gaes's. It was a boy from before Michigan, before the arrangement, before she'd learned that life could pivot on a single desperate yes. A boy who had disappeared the way boys did when things became real. She was 4 months along, barely showing, carrying it like a held breath. Standing in the winter garden with this man who had just offered her the first honest grace anyone had given her in months, she felt the secret shift inside her like something preparing to surface. Not yet, but soon. And for the first time, the thought of telling him didn't feel like detonation. It felt, terrifyingly, like hope. He came back the next morning. Not with words prepared. Not with a plan, which was deeply uncomfortable for a man who had built an empire on never entering a room without one. He came back because at 5:30 in the morning, still in his office chair, he'd fallen into a shallow sleep and dreamed of Leanne. Not her death. Not Tokyo. Just Leanne at their kitchen table in the old house on Maple, drinking coffee in her yellow robe, looking at him over the rim with that particular expression she'd had. The one that meant you already know the answer, Gaes. You're just afraid of what it costs. He'd woken up with his phone in his hand and the Detroit skyline going pale pink outside the window. He sat for a long time. Then he picked up his jacket, took the elevator down 42 floors, and drove home through a city just beginning to remember itself in the early morning gray. Ellen was already at the house when he arrived. Of course she was. She was in the kitchen in a cream cable knit sweater and dark trousers, making oatmeal with the focused energy of a woman who cooked when she was worried, which meant she'd been there since before dawn. She looked at him when he walked in, took in the wrinkled Henley, the unslept face, the jacket held at his side like something he'd forgotten to put down. She's upstairs, Ellen said. She didn't sleep well. I know. Do you? It wasn't a question. Ellen set the wooden spoon down and turned to face him fully. Because I want to make sure you understand what that girl has been carrying. Alone. In a house she didn't choose, in a marriage she didn't choose, with a pregnancy she had no support for, while still showing up every day like she wasn't one poorly timed conversation away from collapse. Gaes said nothing. She protected you, Ellen continued, quieter now. She was afraid of what the truth would cost her, yes. But she was also afraid of what it would cost you. At 18 years old, 4 months pregnant and entirely alone, she was still thinking about what her truth would do to someone else. Ellen picked up the spoon again. That's not deception, Gaes. That's someone who has never once in her life had the luxury of putting herself first. He stood in the kitchen doorway in his wrinkled dark navy Henley and charcoal trousers, and felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in 4 years. Not grief, not guilt, not the architectural numbness he'd constructed so carefully around both. Something that required him to act. I need to talk to her. Yes, Ellen said. You do. He found her in the winter garden. As if the garden had decided it was the only honest place on the property and kept pulling them back. She was walking the stone path slowly in a long forest green wool coat over a cream-ribbed sweater and dark trousers, her hair out in its full natural halo, a pale gray scarf wound loosely around her neck. She hadn't heard him come out. He stood on the stone step and watched her for a moment. The careful placement of her steps on the icy path, the way her hand rested at her side close to her stomach without quite touching it, The particular solitude of a person who had learned to keep their own company. She is 19 years old in 3 weeks, he thought. And she moves like someone who has been tired for a long time. He walked toward her. She heard his footsteps and turned. Her expression did several things in rapid succession. Relief, wariness, a careful neutrality she pulled up like a shield. She'd gotten very good at that. He noticed now how much work it took her. "You came back," she said. "I live here," he said. "That's not what I meant." "I know." He stopped a few feet from her. The winter garden held them both in its bare, dignified quiet. "I came back because I was wrong to leave the way I did." She looked at him steadily. "Waiting. You should have told me sooner," he said. "That's true. And it's also true that we built this entire arrangement on convenience and desperation and very little honest conversation, and I was as responsible for that as anyone." He exhaled, a long, deliberate breath that clouded in the cold. "You were 18 years old, alone, and afraid. And I was a 58-year-old man who handed you a contract and called it a solution." The pause. "I'm not interested in being angry at you for surviving." Something shifted in her face. Not collapse. She didn't collapse. Something quieter. The particular release of a person who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of it is almost harder to process. "I wanted to tell you," she said. Her voice was low and even and entirely honest. "In the garden. That night when you told me about Tokyo. I almost did." "I know. You couldn't have known that." "No," he said. "But I know now. And it matters." He looked at her, fully, without the careful management of distance he'd maintained for weeks. "The baby. Are you, is everything." "We're both fine," she said softly. "Helvet. I have an appointment Thursday." "The beat. I'd like to come," he said. She blinked. Of everything she had prepared herself for, that had not been on the list. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." His voice was quiet and certain in equal measure. "I'd like to." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold winter light. This man who was 40 years her elder, who had walked out and come back, who had dreamed of his dead wife and driven home at dawn, who was standing in a January garden asking to come to her prenatal appointment like it was the most natural thing in the world. And something she had been guarding very carefully behind her sternum, something she'd refused to name, refused to water, refused to acknowledge was even growing, put out a single, tentative leaf. "Okay," she said quietly. "Just that." But the way she said it, soft and careful and real, held the weight of everything neither of them had said yet. He nodded once. They stood together in the winter garden, not touching, not quite smiling, the cold air between them warmer than it had any right to be. And for the first time since a Tuesday in January when a judge read from a document and two people signed their names without looking at each other, something in the arrangement felt chosen. She said, "Okay." One word. 4 months of silence, a secret the size of a life. A man who drove home at dawn because a dream told him what his waking mind had been too guarded to admit, and it all came down to one quiet, careful, real okay. The prenatal appointment was on a Thursday. Gaes drove. He hadn't asked if she wanted him to, he'd simply appeared at the bottom of the stairs at 8:15 in a dark charcoal overcoat and black turtleneck, keys already in hand, in the particular way of a man who had made a decision and was quietly committed to it. Odessa came down in a warm burgundy wrap coat over a cream dress, her hair pinned up softly, small gold studs in her ears. She'd taken extra care and then felt embarrassed about taking extra care and then done it anyway. They drove through Detroit in the early morning quiet. He didn't fill the silence with small talk, which she'd half expected and was grateful he didn't. He drove the way he did most things, steadily, without performance. At a red light, he asked if she'd eaten. She said yes. He said good. That was all. But at the clinic, when she was called in and turned briefly in the waiting room doorway, half expecting him to stay seated with his phone, the way men in arrangements did, he was already standing. He came in without being asked. The ultrasound technician was warm and unhurried, the room dim and clinical and strangely intimate all at once. Odessa lay back in a soft ivory clinic gown, and Gaes sat in the chair beside the bed, not hovering, not performing concern, just present in the solid, unhurried way she'd come to recognize as the truest thing about him. The screen flickered, and then there was sound, fast, rhythmic, impossibly alive. The heartbeat. Odessa felt her eyes fill before she could decide against it. She pressed her lips together, looked at the ceiling. She heard Gaes shift in the chair beside her. She looked at him. He was watching the screen with an expression she had never seen on his face, unguarded in a way that his face, built for boardrooms and difficult decisions, simply didn't know how to maintain. His jaw was set. His eyes were bright. He felt her looking and turned. Neither of them said anything, but his hand moved from his knee, slowly, without announcement, and covered hers where it lay on the bed beside her. Large and warm and certain. She turned her palm up and held on. They didn't talk about it on the drive home. They didn't need to. Some things Odessa had learned were too real for immediate language. You had to let them settle first, let them find their level like water. But that evening, after Ellen had come and gone and the house had gone quiet, she found him in the East Library. He was in the dark green Henley and gray flannel pants, sitting in the leather chair by the lamp with no folder, no phone, no contract. Just sitting. She stood in the doorway in her burgundy wrap coat traded now for an oversized oatmeal sweater and dark leggings, hair down, feet in cream wool socks. "Can I sit?" she asked. "It's your house," he said. "It doesn't feel like mine yet." The pause. "I know." He looked at her. "I'm sorry for that." She crossed the room and sat on the window seat, her usual place, and pulled her knees up loosely. The lamp threw the room in amber. Outside, for once, it had stopped snowing. The winter garden was still and silver-white beneath a clear, cold sky. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement." She said it to the window first, then turned to face him. "I don't know exactly when. Somewhere between the kitchen at midnight and the bread basket and you ordering me a better legal textbook I didn't ask you for." She paused. "I tried not to. I was very committed to not feeling anything that wasn't practical." Something moved across his face. "Odessa." "I'm not finished," she said quietly. "I need you to know that I'm not saying this because I'm scared, or because of the baby, or because I don't have anywhere else to go. I'm saying it because it's true and I've spent my entire life saying true things last, and I'm tired of that." Gaes Bale, who had run a billion-dollar company for 23 years, who had sat across from men who tried to ruin him and shown nothing, who had flown home from Tokyo to a funeral and gone back to work in 8 days, sat in his leather chair in his East Library and looked at this 19-year-old girl in wool socks and an oatmeal sweater and felt the last carefully constructed wall in him come down without drama. Just down. "I'm 58 years old," he said. "I'm aware. I am not an easy man. I've noticed. I work too late. I don't talk about things until they become emergencies. I ordered you a legal textbook because I didn't know how to tell you that watching you read gave me the first feeling of..." He stopped. "Tried again. In 4 years, you are the first thing I've looked forward to." The room held very still. "The midnight kitchen," he said quietly. "The chamomile. The way you looked at me in that dressing room like you were calculating something." The pause. "You were the first person in 4 years who made me feel like the floor was still there." Odessa's eyes filled again. She let them this time. "I'm having another man's baby," she said. "Not as an obstacle. As a fact. Laid on the table cleanly. I know. He held her gaze. I'd like to be there anyway. If you'll let me. His voice was low and entirely without performance. Not as a contract. Not as an arrangement. As a choice. She looked at him across the amber-lit room, across the legal textbook on the shelf, the window seat, the 40 years between them that somehow contained, impossibly, the exact shape of something real. You're choosing this? She asked. Knowing everything? Knowing everything, he said. She uncurled from the window seat, crossed the room, and sat on the ottoman at his feet, close, real, deliberate, and leaned her head against his knee the way you leaned against something you decided to trust. His hand came to rest on her hair, gently, like something he'd been careful with for a long time and was only now allowing himself to hold. They stayed like that, the lamp burning amber, the garden silver and still outside, the heartbeat from that morning living in both their chests like something that had always been there, waiting to be heard. 6 months later, summer arrived in Michigan without asking permission, the way summers do. The garden, that skeletal, honest winter garden that had witnessed more truth than any room in the house, had become something else entirely. Full and green and slightly chaotic, because Odessa had taken over the planting in March and had, by her own admission, been overambitious with the lavender. She stood at the kitchen window in a soft white linen dress, bare feet on the warm tile, watching Gaes in the garden below. He was in a light gray linen shirt and dark trousers, sleeves rolled, crouched beside the lavender beds with an expression of focused uncertainty. He was holding a trowel with the careful unfamiliarity of a man who ran a billion-dollar company and had never once needed to know what to do with a trowel. Ellen stood beside him in a sage green sundress, gesturing instructions he was clearly ignoring. Odessa pressed her hand to the curve of her stomach, full and round now, 8 months along, a miracle she'd stopped apologizing for and started simply holding. She laughed. Quietly. To herself and the baby and the summer morning. Behind her, the refrigerator held a new strawberry magnet, slightly newer than the original, which had been relocated to the center, and beneath it, a small document. Not a legal contract. Not an arrangement. A handwritten note in Gaes's particular blocky print, left on her pillow 3 weeks ago. I'd like to stay married to you. Not because of Gerald. Not because of the board. Because of the bread basket and the chamomile and the wool socks. Because you put your palm up. Tell me yes when you're ready. Take as long as you need. She'd written yes on the back in blue ink and left it on his desk. He'd kept it under his keyboard, which was as close to sentimental as Gaes Bale got, and which she had decided was more than enough. The back door opened. He came in with soil on his hands and the specific expression of a man who had attempted gardening and emerged with complicated feelings about it. The lavender, he said, is a problem. The lavender is thriving, she said. It's everywhere. That's what thriving looks like. He looked at her, at the white linen dress, the full round stomach, the bare feet on the warm tile, the laugh still living at the corner of her mouth. Something moved across his face that had no boardroom equivalent. Pure and unmanaged and entirely his. He crossed the kitchen, stood before her, lifted his clean hand, the one without soil, and tucked the escaped curl behind her left ear. The same curl. Always the same one. Hi, he said quietly. Hi, she said. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead. Then her temple. Then, slowly, like something chosen rather than fallen into, her mouth. She kissed him back with both hands on his chest and summer coming through the window and the lavender thriving beyond all reasonable expectation in the garden behind them. And it was nothing like an arrangement. It was nothing like survival. It was just this warm and real and built from the wreckage of two people who had walked into a room for the wrong reasons and stayed for the right ones. Outside, The garden held its green and lavender riot against the Michigan summer sky. Inside, the strawberry magnet held its place on the refrigerator. And somewhere in the quiet of a house that had finally, completely become a home, a heartbeat counted its steady, certain way toward hello. He chose her, not the contract, not the arrangement, not the optics. She chose him, not the security, not the survival, not the path of least resistance. They chose each other in a kitchen with soil-stained hands and bare feet and a lavender garden that refused to be anything other than exactly, gloriously too much. That's not a fairy tale. That's something better. That's two people who walked in broken and walked out, slowly, imperfectly, beautifully, whole. And you? Did the ending feel earned? Was there a moment you would have written differently, or a turn you didn't see coming? Tell us in the comments, because stories like this one live longest in the conversations they start.